Good morning. This is the Santa Barbara County Planning Commission, and I ask that you please join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So, Mr. Villalobos, do you want to announce the TV coverage?
Yes. Thank you, Chair Bradley. Good morning to the Commission. Planning Commission hearings are televised live on County Santa Barbara Television, CSB TV, Channel 20 at 9 a.m. in the South Coast, Lompoc, San Ynez Valley, Santa Maria, and Orchid areas. Rebroadcast of Planning Commission hearings are on Fridays at 5 p.m. on CSB TV, Channel 20. Today's hearing will also be streamed live on the county's website and will be available for download in a day or two. If you'd like me, I can continue on to the roll call.
Yes.
Okay, great. Commissioner Farini.
Here.
Commissioner Cooney.
Here.
Commissioner Blau.
I'm here.
Chair Bradley.
Here.
And we are expecting Commissioner Park.
As soon as he gets through the 101 slog. Okay, that brings us to the agenda status report. Would that be? Oh, and I'm sorry. This is public comment in a few minutes. Agenda status report, Mr. Wilson.
Good morning, Chair Bradley and members of the Commission. The status of the agenda today is we have 3 items listed on the agenda. Item number 1 is the Causewell appeal of accessory structure, and I understand that there is another request for continuance on that item today. And then we have the item number 2, which is the Highway 101 widening, and staff is ready to present on that item. And then we have continued the Cannabis Zoning Ordinance Amendment workshop that was last Wednesday to today, and that will be heard last today. And so staff is also ready, prepared to present and continue those deliberations today. So that's the status of the agenda.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to continue on with the projection report, or?
Thank you, Chair Bradley. In looking at the projection report, our next scheduled hearing is February 5th, and that is located here in Santa Barbara. We do have items listed on that one. The appeal of the Hacienda Cannabis Project was continued to February 5th. And then I do believe that there is going to be a continuance request for that item. It was scheduled for that date specific, so we will have to at least grant that continuance on that time. And so that will be for February 5th. And then we, the main project on that date is the Hearts Therapeutic Equestrian Center that is scheduled for that date. And I believe that information is going to be coming to you in shortly to be prepared for that. And then there's the Government Code Consistency Determination, which is the Ashbrook Lane proposed abandonment. That's on February 5th. Currently on February 12th, we don't have any items listed at this time. And then our next hearing after that is February 26th. Long Range Planning is anticipated bringing their comprehensive plan annual progress report on that time. And then we have the Energy and Compliance Division has a battery storage project listed for that day. We have Causewell appeal being scheduled for that day, depending on the continuance request today. And then the appeal of the Strauss Wind project that is related to the appeal of the Central Board of Architectural Review has been scheduled for February 26th. And that hearing is located here in Santa Barbara. Following that, we have March 4th. There are no items projected on that date. And then March 11th, we have scheduled, or is projected that the Herbal Angels project may come back to the Planning Commission at that time.
Oh.
And then following that, March 25th, we have a Crown Castle project, and that is a Santa Barbara hearing. And then April 1st, on April Fool's Day, we have a cannabis cultivation project listed there. And then we have also the appeal of the CVW Organics Farm Mix Light Cannabis Cultivation on that same day, on April 1st, and that's in Santa Barbara. So I think that's as far out as the projection report goes, and that's what we have anticipated coming to the hearing in the next couple months.
Thank you. Did any of the commissioners have any questions about that? Okay. Then let's move on to public comment, and we have two speaker slips, Mr. Izal and Mr. Kunzal. Ms. Kunzal, I'm sorry. So we can give you 3 minutes each on their public comment. Please come to the, could you come to the podium?
Ma'am, could you come to the speaker, please?
Yeah, sorry, we just need you to be on tape. Yes, thank you.
There was a traffic accident on coming from Goleta. We barely got here, and Kenan Izal, who was going to present this, is not here. I can't get a hold of him, so I assume he's stuck either on Cathedral Oaks. So is it possible just to change that to, I mean, he'll do it at the next meeting? Because I don't have the information he has to present it. We were here in support. The neighborhood, basically, I mean, I have his notes here. The conditions of approval were not being enforced by the county on the Hergen residential development, and he had a presentation about that, just the specifics of it.
Thank you.
So-
We received the presentation, so maybe this is the time where I'd ask the commission if we can just, or anybody, to just have this at the next meeting. Would that be okay?
So Chair Bradley, if I may, this is public comment of items that are on the agenda, so she's more than welcome to come back at the next hearing under the same public comment period, if they wanted to do that.
I would really suggest that, if everyone concurs. And if you could tell that to Mr. Izal, that would be great. I know he'll
I will
probably
do
come in
that
here and
again.
go, oh my gosh.
He's put it
Sure.
together, so it's better for him to present it.
Our third district commissioner might be right next to him on the freeway right now. We don't, he's delayed
Okay.
for the same reason. So, okay, well, then we'll see you at the next hearing.
Okay, all right, thank you for
Thank you
your
very
time.
much. Okay, that takes us to our informational reports from the commissioners. Does anybody have anything to add? Hearing nothing, we will go to the minutes of December 4th, item 8. Were there any corrections to the item, the minutes of December 4th? Just proofreader. That's right, Commissioner Cooney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner, I would go ahead and move approval of the minutes of December 4. I have a comment on the next meeting.
Okay.
Second.
All in favor of the minutes of December 4th? Aye. Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
you have to do a roll call.
Oh, thank you.
Commissioner Freeney.
Roll call.
Aye.
Commissioner Cooney.
Aye.
Commissioner Blau.
Aye.
And Chair Bradley.
Aye.
Motion passes 4-0.
Thank you. So we move to the minutes of December 11th. Were there any corrections to those or comments? I had one. But Commissioner Cooney.
The very last paragraph, Madam Chair, on page 3, we're continuing the meeting to April 29th, and sure what we did was continue it to January 29th today.
There you go.
But as corrected, I would move approval.
Second.
I actually have one other clarification on these, and I don't think it's changing the meaning at all, but on item number 7, the informational report, the last sentence, it states it was decided that Ag Commissioner should reach out to Planning Commission. Well, the AAC decided that. It wasn't, so I'm not sure if that's important, but it was the Ag Advisory Commission that decided that the commissioner should reach out to the Planning Division and Director Plowman. So can we just change that, the AAC, instead of it was, on that sentence? Thank you. So with those corrections, we already have a first and a second. Roll call vote then?
Commissioner Freeney.
Aye.
Commissioner Cooney,
Aye.
Commissioner Blau,
Aye.
and Chair Bradley.
Aye.
Motion passes 4-0.
Okay. Moving right along here. That brings us to our director's report. Ms. Plowman, would you like to proceed?
Madam Chair, members of the commission, good morning. I wanted to just cover some of the things that have been happening at the Board of Supervisors. Yesterday, there was the first quarter cannabis report prepared by the CEO's office for the board. It shows the tax revenues are on an increase. We talked a little bit about the permit process in that presentation as well. In the afternoon, the board heard the Strauss appeal, and they denied the appeal and upheld the Planning Commission's approval. So that project will be moving forward. Of course, you understand that there's an appeal of the C-Bar's decision on preliminary approval of the design, and that'll be back at the commission and possibly may go to the board as well if it gets appealed. We will be bringing back the guidance document on hoop structures for creek setbacks to the Board of Supervisors on the 11th. Originally, it was scheduled for the 4th of February. Now it's going to be on the 11th. And also the cannabis retail scoring system will be on the 11th at the Board of Supervisors. So that's the storefront retail. We have a couple of the cannabis appeals that made it up to the board that have been pushed out some. Santa Rita and West Coast, the two projects that you decided on, are going to be heard by the board on the 10th of March. And then Busy Bee will be heard by the board on the 17th of March. And then lastly, we have the Elwood appeal, and that's going to be, that got postponed. There's a hope that they can sort of resolve their differences. But if they cannot, we'll be going on the 24th of March to the Board of Supervisors. And I have one more thing I wanted to mention, and that was on February 6th, the Ag Advisory Committee has a meeting here in this room, and it is a presentation from a gentleman from Santa Clara County. On his name is Michael Meehan, and he's going to be presenting some work that they did with sort of some planning document that they prepared for farming and agricultural uses up in that area that I think was award-winning. So there'll be a presentation here, and you're encouraged to participate or listen in to learn something new. And I also did want to mention that I'll be working with the chair to talk to him about how the AAC and the Planning Commission can work together on resolving some questions that the Planning Commission may have about agricultural operations. And we'll be coming back with some suggestions.
Very good. That's encouraging. I thought her report was very illuminating, so. Okay, were there any questions from the commission to staff on the director's report? No, hearing none. We will move to our standard agenda. So, Mr. Villalobos, would you like to read that into the record?
Yes, Chair Bradley. The following is a hearing on the request of Susan Petrovic, agent for Seaward International Company, to consider case number 19 APL5, appeal filed on April 15, 2019, to appeal the director's approval of case number 15 LUP 468.
Thank you. Okay. I forgot my cheat sheet, but I should know this. So we will proceed with staff's presentation, or actually, this is a request for a continuance. So, Mr. Tuttle.
Madam Chair, Commissioners, yes, there is a request by both parties, the appellant and the applicant, to continue this to the February 26th Planning Commission hearing date. And staff concurs with the continuance request.
Okay, were there any questions from staff about this? All right, hearing none, and I have no speaker slips, but I see Ms. Petrovic in the audience. I believe we can make a motion to continue that. Do I hear a motion?
Chair, it is your district, but if you don't mind, I'll make that motion to continue.
That's a good point. Please do.
I'll second the motion.
Thank you. Still learning up here. Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
With a roll call vote by Mr. Villalobos.
Sorry.
I'm just blasting through the agenda, sorry.
Commissioner Freeney.
Aye.
Commissioner Cooney.
Aye.
Commissioner Blau.
Aye.
And Chair Ridley.
Aye.
Motion passes 4-0.
Thank you. All right, now that is pretty good timing, you guys. Now we actually move to item 2 on our standard agenda. Mr. Villalobos, would you read that into the record?
Yes, thank you, Chair Bradley. The following is a hearing on a request of the State of California Department of Transportation to consider case numbers 19 DVP 26 and 19 CDP 53.
Thank you. So I see we have staff here, and that would be our next step for a staff presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, Chair Bridley, members of the Commission. I'm presenting the Highway 101 widening project today. The project consists of 2 segments, specifically segments B and C of a larger Highway 101 widening project, which extends from Baylord Avenue to Sycamore Creek. So what you'll see on the slide here is the full extent of the Highway 101 widening, but today we're looking at just segments B and C. The project includes the addition of both north and southbound HOV or high occupancy vehicle lanes from the City of Carpinteria boundary heading southbound and just past this Sheffield interchange heading northbound. So this slide shows both segments B and C. The purpose of the proposed project is to increase roadway capacity and to reduce peak hour travel times. Currently, motorists experience 2 to 4 hours of delay during peak travel times, and that delay is projected to reach up to 10 hours by 2040. The project also incorporates bicycle and pedestrian improvements to support multimodal travel and coastal access. Widening of the highway will occur almost entirely within Caltrans' right-of-way, and the widening will occur either inward towards the center median or outward towards the existing travel lanes in order to preserve ocean views and vegetation and to minimize grading to the maximum extent feasible. The Highway 101 widening project was conceived of more than 20 years ago, and over the last 20 years, extensive outreach, including over 100 public meetings, have occurred in order to garner public input. The project is a key component of the 101 in Motion plan, which consists of multiple elements that together would implement a multimodal strategy to accommodate future travel demand while facilitating a modal shift to carpooling, transit, and passenger rail. In 2019, the Board of Supervisors approved a local coastal program amendment to address wetland impacts and policy inconsistency that was known would occur as a result of the 101 widening project. The amendment allowed for the project to encroach into wetland and buffer areas in exchange for a number of balancing projects that would improve coastal access and pedestrian and bicycle facilities. I will discuss these policies in detail later in the presentation. Over the next few slides, I will walk through the project starting at the Carpinteria city limits and ending just past the Sheffield interchange. This slide shows the first portion of segment 4B, beginning at the Carpinteria salt marsh. Within this section, improvements to the South Padaro Lane undercrossing are proposed, along with a 1,000-foot long and 15-foot tall wall at Villa Real and a 2,000-foot long, 12 to 16-foot tall wall near the Santa Claus Lane exit. This slide shows the existing condition at Santa Claus Lane before installation of the proposed sound wall. And here we see the proposed condition following the installation of the sound wall. This slide shows the proposed design for the South Padaro undercrossing. In the next portion of segment 4B is the Arroyo Paradon Bridge improvement, another portion of the Santa Claus Lane sound wall, and another sound wall along northbound Highway 101. This sound wall is 1,300 feet in length and 12 to 16 feet in height. This area also includes the Memorial Oaks design elements. The Memorial Oaks were planted to honor World War II soldiers, and some of the remaining Memorial Oaks will be removed as a part of the project. Oh. Within the Memorial Oaks enhancement area, a unique median barrier and commemorative signage are proposed, along with planting of oaks propagated from Memorial Oaks. The Memorial Oaks enhancement area continues onto the last portion of segment 4B. This section also includes Toro Canyon Creek Bridge improvements, a construction support area, and a portion of the 100-foot long, 12-foot high sound wall bisected by Caspia Lane and protecting Ocean View Park. I will now move on to segment 4C. One important thing to note is that the 4C plans that are shown on the screen are oriented differently than the 4B plans. With these plans, the ocean side is at the top of the screen and the mountainside is at the bottom. Within section 1 of segment 4C, primary includes freeway widening and landscaping, as well as the remaining segment of the sound wall at Ocean View Park. Within section 2, it includes the Evans Avenue undercrossing, the sound wall at Ortega Hill, which is 800 feet long and 16 feet tall. This slide shows the proposed Evans Avenue undercrossing. And this slide shows the Ortega Hill sound wall. And you'll notice at the top of the sound wall is a section of clear panel, which we'll discuss earlier, and is designed to protect public views. This slide shows the final portion of segment 4B, including the North Jameson sound wall, which is 1,500 feet long and 10 feet tall, and the Sheffield undercrossing. At Sheffield, the southbound exit will be moved from the right to the left side. And this slide shows the proposed Sheffield undercrossing. And here we see the view from the freeway near the Sheffield undercrossing before and after the proposed project. The project includes consistent design elements throughout for median barrier and sound walls, and a unique treatment for the Memorial Oaks area, which are shown on the slide here. Caltrans is the lead agency under CEQA for the proposed project, with the county acting as a responsible agency. Environmental review completed for the project included a 2014 EIR, which found Class 1 impacts in aesthetics, visual resources, and Class 2 impacts in biological resources, cultural resources, noise, paleontology, and water quality. In 2017, a revised EIR was prepared, which found Class 1 impacts to transportation circulation as a result of impacts at intersections. And then in 2018, an addendum was prepared to address minor changes in the environment. The EIRs in 2017 and 2014 included mitigation measures which have been incorporated into the project as conditions of approval. In addition, condition of approval 26 requires preparation of a mitigation, monitoring, and reporting plan to ensure compliance with the EIR mitigation measures. I will now move into the consistency analysis discussion. With regard to visual resources, policies require protection of public and coastal views, minimization of landform alteration, and design that is compatible with the surrounding area. The project would be consistent with these requirements because the project would be confined to the Caltrans right-of-way in order to limit view impacts, landform alteration, and vegetation removal. Select sound walls were eliminated in the review process in order to preserve public and coastal views, and certain sound walls are topped with clear panels, again, to preserve views. Finally, community-appropriate design and landscaping were coordinated with both the South BAR and Montecito BAR. With regard to biological resources, policies require protection and replacement of oak, native, and specimen trees, and they also require a 100-foot wetland buffer. However, specific policy exceptions allow for wetland encroachment in association with the highway widening project. The project is consistent with these requirements because it proposes tree replacement with trees of various sizes at a ratio of 3:1. Conditions require preparation of a tree protection plan to protect existing trees and to guide establishment of new trees. And the project proposes wetland restoration at a ratio of 3:1. Finally, Caltrans prepared a mitigation and monitoring plan that details restoration and monitoring procedures for the restored wetlands. Additional biological resource policies require protection and enhancement of environmentally sensitive habitat areas, protection of areas within 200 feet of butterfly roosts, and protection of steelhead trout. The project would be consistent with these requirements because it includes riparian restoration, removal of invasive species, butterfly surveys and fencing to protect butterfly areas, and fish passage improvements associated with replaced bridges. Specific policies pertaining to the balancing projects discussed earlier require completion of a specific list of coastal access and non-motorized travel projects. And they require that the balancing projects be open to the public no later than the adjacent phase of the highway project. The project would be consistent with these requirements because the South Padaro and Evans Avenue balancing projects are incorporated into the proposed project itself. The remaining projects are moving forward at different stages of design and the permitting process. And Condition 25 requires completion of the balancing projects no later than the adjacent phase of the highway. With regard to transportation and circulation, policies require that roadways and intersections, generally, with a number of exceptions, should operate at level of service B, and that overpass improvements should accommodate bicycle facilities. The project would be consistent with these requirements because the existing level of service for Highway 101 at peak times is level of service F, and many intersections currently operate below level of service B and are projected to worsen by 2040. With implementation of the proposed project, there would be an overall improvement to level of service at intersections and roadways, and projected 2040 conditions would improve. Finally, the project incorporates bicycle improvements at the South Padaro and Evans Avenue undercrossings. With regard to water quality, policies require that the biological productivity of coastal waters be maintained, that degradation of water quality be avoided, and that the projects do not cause or contribute to flood hazards. The project will be consistent with these requirements because the project incorporates low-impact development strategies to minimize runoff, includes permanent and construction best management practices, such as compost incorporation and the use of willow cuttings to facilitate infiltration, includes a stormwater control plan, and the project does not contribute to flood hazards. Finally, the replaced bridges allow for increased flow capacity and infiltration. With regard to cultural resources, policies require avoidance of sites if feasible and consultation with Native American representatives. Project would be consistent with these requirements because the project avoids cultural sites, uses exclusionary protective fencing, and conditions of approval require both archaeological and Native American monitoring. With regard to noise, policies place a 65 dBA limit for noise-sensitive uses. The project would be consistent with these requirements because noise contour maps show that many properties near Highway 101 currently exceed 65 decibels, and the proposed project includes noise attenuating elements, including sound walls, noise attenuating pavement, and funding for acoustical treatment of homes. The project would be consistent with applicable ordinance requirements as well. The project is within the Transportation Corridor Wetland Overlay, which requires wetland restoration and stormwater management. And as previously discussed, the project includes wetland restoration, including a mitigation monitoring plan and stormwater management plans. The project is also within the environmentally sensitive habitat overlay, which specifies protection of specific biological resources. And again, as previously discussed, the project would be consistent with these requirements for protection of wetland, butterfly, and riparian ESH areas. For all of these reasons, staff is recommending approval of the proposed project. But before concluding, I would like to discuss some changes that staff recommends to Condition 25. This condition relates to the balancing projects, and you'll see on the screen changes that staff is recommending. We've been in coordination with the applicant, and these changes are intended to help respond to some of the concerns they had regarding the condition. We understand that this may not satisfy all of their concerns, but at this point, this is staff's recommendation for Condition 25 related to the balancing projects. Therefore, staff recommends that your commission make the required findings for approval of the project, including CEQA findings, determine that none of the conditions in CEQA guidelines section 15162 requiring a subsequent EIR have occurred, and approve the project subject to the conditions of approval as modified in my presentation today. I do also know the applicant has a presentation that they'd like to provide that includes additional details on the proposed project. That will conclude staff's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Liu. And so we have our applicants, and you can introduce yourselves and then take it from there. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair Bridley and Commissioners. I'm Fred Luna. I'm with the Santa Barbara County Association of Governments, and we're a project sponsor with Caltrans on the project, and I'll let our other team members and presenters introduce themselves.
Madam Commissioner, members of the board, my name is David Emerson. I'm with Caltrans. I'm the project manager.
And good morning. My name is Zach Sevilla. I'm with Mark Thomas and Company. We're a design consultant that was hired to advance the design on many portions of the 101 project.
Thank you. And so we do have a presentation. We thank you for the opportunity to be able to present. Am I able to use this advancer here? Is this okay? Thank you so much. First of all, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be able to present for this project. As was mentioned, it's been long in the making, and there's a number of years and decades when you talk about this project going forward. And I also want to thank Ms. Liu and Mr. Tuttle for their help as we've gone through the process of going through completeness determination and through the bar process and getting to this point where we're on the verge of project approval for 2 segments of Highway 101. This is really an exciting time for Highway 101 in the sense that we're on the verge of starting construction in Carpinteria. We do have funding for the first 7 miles of the project. 5 of the miles are subject to construction and the action of your planning commission today. But we did receive the permit from the city of Carpinteria in April of last year, and we intend to start construction in the city of Carpinteria in April of this year. And then we do have plans under Senate Bill 1, which was statewide funding that's been made available to regional agencies and Caltrans like our. We have a plan to submit funding this year for the next cycle of funds. And so that would essentially complete the full 11 miles of the corridor. So the story of 101 really starts with even before this, but this is a good exhibit of what the project is, and your commission is acting on some components of that project, some segments of the project, but this is the limits of the project that was studied by Caltrans in the environmental document. They did a comprehensive corridor study for what we later called Phase 4 of the Highway 101 project. This is 11 miles in length from Carpinteria to Santa Barbara, and it's fairly extensive. We've introduced ourselves already, so I'm going to jump into the background of our HOV lane strategy. So you can see Phase 4 right there in the middle. That's one part of our overall strategy of how we were going to widen Highway 101 from Santa Barbara down to Muscle Shoals. So if you go back, turn back the clock, like Ms. Liu indicated, over 20 years in the early 1990s, Caltrans had just completed widening Highway 101 through downtown, removing traffic signals. If many of you are familiar or lived in this area, that happened in 1991. And there was a plan on board to widen the remainder of 101 from 2 to 3 lanes in each direction between Santa Barbara and Muscle Shoals. 3 lanes existed on either side at that point. So that there was that gap in Highway 101, which is a significant interregional travel route in the corridor. SBCAG passed Measure D back in 1990, which had seed money for widening 101 and basically to leverage state gas tax dollars at that time. And Caltrans actually started a widening environmental document in the early 90s, which was not accepted by the community, and it fell by the wayside in 1993. But what did come out of that was that the funding that had been secured, both state gas tax and the Measure D dollars at the time, the local sales tax money, was leveraged into 2 operational improvement projects, which you see as number 1 and number 3 on this picture. And those continued to move forward over the years. And number 1 is what we call the Milpas Hot Springs project. That was essentially the first 2 miles on the very northern end. That was completed in 2012. And that added a 3rd lane in each direction between Milpas and Cabrillo. It didn't replace the Cabrillo interchange, but we'll be getting into that a little bit as we discuss that going forward. And then phase 3 was the Linden Casitas, which is under construction right now in the city of Carpinteria, and that's scheduled to be completed later this year. So essentially, that money that was approved back then kind of laid the groundwork for the remaining segments. And then in 2006, we, with the passage of Prop 1B, there was an opportunity under that bond to get a project built in partnership with District 7 and Ventura County Transportation Commission to add the first HOV lanes in Santa Barbara County, 6 miles from Muscle Shoals up into Carpinteria. And that was funded and approved and built and completed in 2015. So that added the 6 miles, and that left that middle section, phase 4, which is 11 miles long. The history behind that really stems back to what Ms. Liu had indicated, 101 in motion. Before Caltrans started the environmental document, we knew that there was a multiple number of strategies and alternatives that people would want to see to improve congestion in this corridor. And so the 101 in motion was a broad team of Caltrans, SBCAG, and local officials that got together to look at a number of different congestion relief strategies that resulted into these components that were part of the overall solution to resolve congestion, long-term congestion relief in the corridor. The HOV lane, peak hour rail, transit services, and then transportation demand management and other operational improvements in the corridor. And this is a graphic that we use a lot to show like what is the strategy, what is the result of these different components. The HOV lane attributes us about 2/3 of the congestion relief strategy for long-term in the corridor. Rail is about 18%, and then operational improvements and TDM are about 9% each. So based on traffic volumes forecasted and how we're handling congestion, these 4 components would be split in this arrangement based on 101 in motion. With that idea in mind that we had a overall strategy for congestion relief, we had a number of different projects that we could present to voters, and that was done in 2008 in the Measure A ordinance that went to the voters and was approved at a 79% approval rating. That was one of the highest approval ratings for a transportation sales tax initiative at that time, and still is one of the highest. The strategy was that Highway 101 was a regional project, not just a South Coast project. It's an interregional corridor, and it was right off the top something that people could see and prominently that our objective is to solve congestion on Highway 101. The voters approved $140 million in 2008, or approximately 14% of the total revenue that was to be collected. And with Measure A passed, and at about the same time, Caltrans initiated a multi-agency project development team. So building on the relationships that occurred during 101 in motion, we continued that with Caltrans, working alongside City of Santa Barbara, City of Carpinteria, and the county staff to put together a project development team that would go through and develop the environmental document for the project. This required a number and extensive technical studies in the corridor and a broad community outreach that just built upon the community outreach that was done during 101 in motion as well. So Ms. Liu indicated some of the project purposes, but overall reduce congestion and delay, capacity for future travel demand, improve travel time within the corridor, HOV lane continuity to basically continue what was built with the Muscle Shoals project to the south, and then rehabilitate existing lanes and ramps. That was something that was added later based on the addendum that was completed that Ms. Liu indicated to provide full concrete paving across all 3 lanes for long-lasting surface, so that we don't have to go back and have to maintain that facility over and over again. This slide kind of is the end result of what happened in the environmental document, and it really shows that when Caltrans presented alternatives to the community, and that they really thought about the resources that would be potentially impacted by the project itself, and that the alternatives were set up in that way so that they were presented as inside widening, which would remove median landscaping, outside widening, where in some cases you would have either wetland impacts or exterior landscaping impacts, or a balance of those depending on the context of that area and what were the sensitive resources in that area. And we called that the hybrid alternative. And that essentially was the alternative that was selected, the hybrid alternative, which really took into account what resources in that particular area are being most affected by the project, and to minimize that impact by selecting either an inside or an outside widening depending on which area we're in. And as Mr. Emerson and Mr. Saviglia go through the details of the project, you'll be able to see how that what manifests itself in the design. So now we're moving forward with implementation, and this is our 5-phase strategy. So overall, 101 is about a $700 million project. And so early on, we knew that we couldn't build it as one construction contract. And plus, we have 3 jurisdictions where we need coastal permits from. The entire project's in the coastal zone. So we broke up the project into 5 distinct segments. One in the city of Carpinteria on the south, one in the city of Santa Barbara on the north, and then the 3 in the center were in the county's jurisdiction. And so we broke those up just based on different geographic areas and somewhat related to the different community plans that we would anticipate having to present the project on based on different policy issues. And specifically before you today is the 2 segments that are in the county, 4B and 4C, or we're calling the Padaro and the Summerlin segments. These are fully funded. SBK and Caltrans were able to get money from Senate Bill 1 and then statewide SHOP money, which is Caltrans rehabilitation and maintenance money, to fully fund these projects. And like I mentioned before, Segment 4A in the city of Carpinteria is about to start construction in April. So segments 4B and C, the design is well advanced, and segment 4C would start construction in October, pending approval by this body, and 4B in 2021. Our presenters will get into some of the more details of it, but this is kind of a high-level view of some of the features in those 2 segments. In segment 4B, the Padaro segment, we have the Padaro and Santa Claus Lane undercrossing that will be entirely replaced and redone. In the Summerlin segment, we have the Evans Avenue undercrossing, and then going over Ortega Hill, we also have the Sheffield interchange. That'll be completely reconstructed, and removal of those left-hand ramps, as Ms. Liu indicated. Then we have the long-life concrete paving, the concrete paving that I mentioned before, that is funded so that it's a much more sustainable project. We have creek bridges in the Padaro segment at Arroyo Paradon and Toro Creek. And then we have sound walls throughout, and those will be described by our presenters. And then ramp and drainage improvements throughout. So I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about our balancing projects and kind of building on what Ms. Liu indicated as the local coastal program amendment and the balancing project. So Caltrans and SBK, took to heart the direction through the LCPA to work with the agencies. We got those funded. I think the good news story takeaway was that those projects were included in our application package for statewide money, and they're, for the most part, all funded. And so I'll get to that in just a second. The Santa Claus Lane Bikeway project is fully funded through construction. SBK's the lead on that project through the environmental. An environmental document is about to be approved on that project, and we will commence the detailed design fairly shortly. The Santa Claus Lane Streetscape project, the county's been leading that project through environmental. They've gotten project approval and the environmental approval as of last year. SBCAG voted funds for the county to continue on the design, and we do have an agreement with the county through a memorandum of understanding to continue that project forward. Then the next 3 projects are smaller projects that were included in our Senate Bill 1 ask for money. They're fully funded through all the phases of development, Padaro coastal signage, coastal access signage along Padaro, and then a sidewalk improvement from North Padaro down to Loon Point Park. And then there's a restroom facility at Loon Point, which is currently not funded, but through the Senate Bill 1 money, but it could be funded through other sources, and if there's questions, I'd certainly be able to elaborate on that. And then moving on, Policy 732 addressed some additional projects. The first 2 projects are really at South Padaro Undercrossing and Evans Avenue. Those are integral to the highway improvements, so they're really not separate projects. Those will be built with the highway improvements, and those are fully funded as well with the highway. Then as we move on down, Via Real is a multi-use pathway in the community of Summerland between Greenwell and North Padaro. Then along Finney Road, there were some coastal access improvements, and then along Wallace Avenue, the local coastal program amendment described some coastal parking that being improved in that area. And so those are projects that we currently meet on a monthly basis with county staff and review progress on those projects. Environmental is done on those projects, and so at any point in time, detailed design could commence. Then the last 4 projects are some other projects related to improvements in Lookout Park, which based on a recent report, we understand that the county's Community Services District has made significant improvements on those at Lookout Park. And there's a short eucalyptus gap closure in the sidewalk along Eucalyptus Lane on the coastal side, which no work has been done to date, but we imagine that would be started when our work related to the Montecito segment would start. On San Isidro Roundabout and Olive Mill Roundabout, the county and the city of Santa Barbara have been participating in meetings and advancing that project, and they're nearing project approval and environmental clearance on that. And those will be included in SBCAG's. I think the important thing is that this year is an opportunity to fully fund the entire corridor, and Caltrans and SBCAG will be including all those unfunded projects in our request for statewide money. And this is my last slide, just to describe, county staff had asked that we just kind of describe our process for public outreach as we've coordinated through the coastal development permit process. And that commenced in early coordination with county staff on development of what would be in our application and the start of the design review team process. And as you can see, that commenced in April of 2018. And we had about 15 design review team meetings upstairs here, going through all the details of the project for the 5 miles, from bridges to sound walls to a number of different other elements. And at 2 different steps along the process, we had stakeholder outreach. As we were going through the design review team, checking in with them as decisions or recommendations were being made and presenting things, going out to the community and presenting those, getting some feedback, bringing that back to the DRT. And then we summarized that final design review, and then we commenced finished our application process, and then started the bar process simultaneously. And that was conducted the spring, summer of last year through the fall. So there was a number of meetings there. I'd like to point if there's any questions, we have a quick reference guide that we've handed out to you that talks about all of the public outreach that we've conducted, the different, the bar process, and in our view, how this project is consistent with the policies of the county on a summary level in the different resource areas. So I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Emerson, and he's going to talk about the project guiding principles.
Thank you, Fred. I'll start with what are our guiding principles, which were established when the PDT was first formed in the early 2000s. As Fred indicated, we did study a number of alternatives. Originally, there were a number of alternatives before that even, alternatives that included full 10-foot median planting through the whole corridor. And going through that exercise made us realize that the impacts associated with that means that the freeway moves out, starts to impact the frontage roads, and starts to impact private property. And it starts to become very expensive. So the project team recognized early on that we need to focus on alternatives that were, in fact, financially viable. In addition to that, or in combination with that, was the thought of minimizing the take of private property. We recognize that we do have a narrow right-of-way corridor here, but we do have enough room to add the HOV lanes without taking undue necessarily private property. Also, to minimize the impacts of historic and cultural resources, as well as other environmental resources. Encourage stakeholder and public improvement. Public input. Mrs. Liu characterized it very succinctly but accurately. We've had a number of stakeholder meetings and involvement procedures throughout the whole development process. Next is to develop a project that's compatible with the community character, which is a challenging thing to do. This is a very unique situation. This is a unique area. Caltrans appreciates the character of this community and how the freeway just weaves through it. The idea is, how do we maintain that? How do we develop a freeway that still looks like it belongs here and is compatible with all the adjacent features? Also, preserving coastal views. This freeway, as Fred mentioned, is entirely in the coastal zone through the project limits. And in many cases, it's right on the bluffs or right near the ocean with ocean views. And so those are very important to CEQA as well as the users, and to Caltrans as well. So one of our goals was to maximize coastal views wherever possible and minimize any impacts. And finally, but not least, I should say, is addressing user and worker safety. So the freeway needs to be a safe facility. So we're talking about the shoulder width, the curvature of the roadway, the profile as it goes up and down, so that we can ensure that traffic doesn't create bottlenecks by the fact that they can't see ahead of them by a substantial distance, or if there's inadequate shoulders for pulling over errant vehicles or disabled vehicles. And of course, maintenance worker safety. So we are using the CRCP, which is a long life pavement, which will diminish the need to go in periodically and refreshen the surface of the roadway. And we're also providing a lot of additional new landscaping, which always requires maintenance. We've designed a landscape that minimizes the need for maintenance workers to be out there, but the recognition is that we will have to maintain this. So we want to make sure that whatever we put out there can be safely maintained, so we don't end up with situations where we can't access our planting to maintain. So what I'll do is I'll walk through the project, and it's going to be very similar to the presentation that Ms. Liu gave. I'll try to avoid duplication and dive into some of the details where appropriate. I'll focus on the sound walls, the barriers. These all context-sensitive solutions were derived from our process involvement in the DRT experience. So these were all developed with local architects and engineers. The barriers, the contrasting surface treatment, which is the paving between the on and off ramp where that meets the main line. And then I'll focus on landscape and planting. And instead of going through the whole project, I'll focus on some key interchanges and talk about the themes that we've established for those and how that plays into the design. Then we'll talk about median planting, wetland and mitigation planting, touch on the memorial oaks, and then we'll wrap it up with a presentation on the structure design themselves. So I'll start with sound walls. Sound wall placement, Caltrans follows the FHWA, Federal Highway Administration protocol for dealing with sound and noise abatement. The consultant who prepared the technical study went out and placed measurements in the field, established the existing sound, and then created a model and added the additional traffic that the project would add to the site, and document what that increase in sound would be. As Ms. Liu pointed out, most of the area within this corridor is already experiencing sound levels higher than the threshold. So The next step would be is to design a sound wall that would protect those residents from that sound and evaluate the cost of that wall versus the number of benefited receptors that it would receive. So I'll get into some of the sound walls, and you'll see there are places where sound walls are and places where sound walls are not, and I can provide an explanation for those instances. You'll also notice that in some places we have sound walls that will be in the floodplains, and so I will show you how we've handled that, and places where there were sound walls that blocked ocean views. And the project development team, including members of the county and the city of Santa Barbara and the Carpinteria, made the decision to pull some sound walls out to preserve these ocean views from local streets. I'll also touch on the fact that there are some severe receptors in this corridor. Severe receptor is a special category of receptor in which the noise level is above 75 decibels, and we go above and beyond in those instances to provide sound attenuation to those receptors. And I'll demonstrate that with a wall location. There's a couple of occasions where the sound walls occur off of the state right-of-way. So we'll touch on that. And lastly, but not least, I'll talk about the architectural details associated with each group of sound walls. So this is what we call our user-friendly plans. Ms. Liu showed this, and I'll just replicate what she demonstrated and add a little detail. Can I have the pointer there, Fred? Is there a pointer on this?
There's a pointer on that one. They have a little red bar.
Oh, I see. Okay, so this wall shows all of our project details. It's a little small to see, but it shows sound walls. It shows in green where our planting is proposed. It shows the median barrier in red. There are retaining walls. It's hard to tell in this instance, but there's a light green and a dark green. The dark green is wetland mitigation areas. It also shows overhead signs. You'll see a few overhead signs and the lighting associated with the freeway. The CST I mentioned earlier is this little band of concrete here at the tips of the on and off ramps. So the first wall, as Ms. Liu mentioned, is actually an extension of a wall coming from 4A. So it protects this neighborhood just off of Kramer Lane. It's a couple hundred feet long. It's about 15 feet tall, 14 or 15 feet tall. This next wall is along the Padaro Lane. You can see it's protecting those neighborhoods along the beach. It's 12 to 16 feet tall. Most of the wall, it's 2,000 feet long, but most of the wall is that 12 feet high. It just increases to 16 feet at the very terminus where the wall extends down and the freeway's raising in elevation. So the wall has to raise a little bit to accommodate that. These walls have a texture that's built off on what's existing currently. This is the wall in Toro Canyon. They're made with multicolored block with varying widths, so you get this mosaic pattern as well as some dimensional interest. This is the default sound wall aesthetic for the corridor, but I should also highlight the fact that the sound wall itself is aesthetic, but the final aesthetic treatment that we want to see on these walls is vegetation. We would like to block them so they're not visible. That helps to contribute to the vegetated nature of the corridor, and prevent graffiti so our maintenance forces don't have to go out and control graffiti. Marching north, this is the Toro Canyon area. You'll see the polo fields up towards the top of the screen. This yellow bar here is the Paradon Creek structure. That same wall that I just discussed stretches into this area as well. So that's the floodplain that this wall stretches through, and I'll show you a detail of how we've handled that. And then back here, this dashed line is the existing sound wall at Toro Canyon. It's the staggered sound wall with the in and out block texture, which we're repeating. We'll be extending that to cover the rest of that neighborhood. So here's a visual of this is similar to the wall we have at Salinas down by the tennis courts. This has floodgates in it to allow flood flows to flow through the wall if ever needed. Again, moving northward, this dashed line is the extension of that existing wall again. And then here's the wall at Caspia Lane, protecting the Summerlin cottages and Ocean View Park. So Ocean View Park is a severe receptor, so we've taken extraordinary measures to make sure that wall provides attenuation to this park. It's a public space. So you'll see the footprint of the wall here. It protects the park as well as the neighborhood above it. It's a 12-foot high wall. Half of the wall is the CMU wall with concrete stone veneer, sandstone veneer on it, and the top half of it is these clear plexiglass glass panels. This wall will be maintained by forces other than Caltrans. It's maintained by the Summerlin Citizens Association, or the Summerlin Cottages rather Association, but the wall itself is on county property. You'll see the equestrian trail still exists behind the wall. This is a view from Ocean View Park, looking out to the ocean. This is taken from a seated position at one of the benches there. So you can see how that ocean view is really a prominent feature in this park. In fact, when the wall is built, it actually enhances that view a little bit. So there are some hedges right now that block a little bit of the view. I think that was to give the park some privacy and some sound attenuation. With this wall, that won't be necessary. So now you get a much larger, expansive view from the park. The next wall is the Ortega Hill wall. That's protecting this neighborhood right here. And again, I won't repeat Miss Lou, but essentially it's a 14 to 16 foot wall. The top portion is clear. This wall happens to be on Caltrans right of way, so this needs to adhere to Caltrans standards as far as being exposed to traffic and pedestrians. So we're not using the stone veneer in this instance. This is the similar in and out block texture that we have in other locations. And we have vine planting to deter graffiti. And the reason the clear panels are up so high on this wall is that we want to make sure that this particular bike path gets a lot of pedestrian traffic. In an attempt to deter graffiti and reduce maintenance efforts, we want to put that clear glass panel up a little bit higher so it's away from the hands of potential vandalism. This is that same wall looking from the opposite direction. This is at the Evans southbound off-ramp. You can just see the tail portion of that wall, and then the barrier that protects the bike path. The final wall is at Sheffield Interchange. It's this long wall here. It is 10 feet tall, and you'll notice that this wall is also on the edge of pavement. So this is a rendering of how that wall looks. We've installed a concrete barrier at the base of the wall, offset a few feet, so that we can provide a planter pocket in between the two. Again, that wall's in the back here. From the residential street side, that wall is pretty close to the pavement. And in fact, it's on the pavement. We need to maintain the bicycle facilities in this area. So what the vines are doing is the vines are actually planted on the freeway side, and there's holes cored through this sound wall so the vines can grow through and establish themselves on the back side. The image up in the corner is an example of that. I believe that's from it looks like Santa Maria. Here's a detail of our median barrier. Now, this is the sound walls and the median barrier, and the next few items are items that are continuous through the whole corridor. So they're kind of a unifying element that's tying the project together visually as one cohesive element. So we have this concrete median barrier. It's made with integrally colored concrete. And then you'll notice the band, it's a 12-inch band located just below the top of the barrier, is the same in and out texture that we see on the sound walls. By default, the barrier is 42 inches high, except where there are planted medians or ocean views. In that case, the barrier goes down to 36-inch high to allow ocean views. And because we don't need the extra height there, the planting provides that separation. So the 42-inch barrier gives you a little separation between opposing traffic. And in the case of the planting, that accomplishes that. So we don't need the extra height on the barrier. Beyond the Gore paving is another feature that we added to the project. Essentially, this pavement is added to reduce maintenance efforts in very narrow areas on the freeway, which are exposed to last-minute driver decisions and can be very dangerous and hard to maintain. So we end up paving those so that we can end up with a wider planting space that's further away from traffic, and it doesn't look to the driver like an area that they should stop and pull over and check cell phone messages or anything like that. So what we've come up with is a sandstone cobble sort of a texture with a colored grout in between, and it's flat. So it is drivable, but it's not intended to be a drivable surface. And instead of this ending of an abrupt edge here, it has a gentle arc to it and a curve, so to give it more of a natural appearance and blend in with the landscape. This is an example of our treatment for the guardrail. This is a stained galvanized metal. It's similar to a product called Corten, which is a rusted metal. We can't use Corten because of the rust weakens the strength. This is a stain that naturally oxidizes. It's sprayed on at the factory and installed, so it gives a nice rustic rural feel. That's continuous through the project. You'll recognize the modified Type 80 bridge rail. This is a picture of Olive Mill. It's a concrete barrier with this heavy wood textured beam that's stained to look like a beam, reminiscent of the bridge rails in the corridor. That's another consistent element that shows up on all of our structures. This is a view of that from the Sheffield interchange looking north. You can see the Type 80 on either side, as well as on the south. This also allows ocean views where the barrier is up against the ocean side of the freeway. Okay, so I've talked about some of the more hardscape elements. I'll focus on the landscape planting now. I'm going to focus on 3 distinct interchanges, the South Padaro interchange, the Evans interchange, and Sheffield. These areas are where the planting tends to be the widest, so we're able to create the most impact with our planting concept. So I'll show you a before image of the South Padaro. Everyone I'm sure recognizes this. As you're driving southbound, this is one of the few opportunities in the corridor to actually see sandy beach and see people on the beach playing and check out how the waves look and the recreation that's happening. So the goal with this is to provide, you'll see the palm trees as well. So we're building off the palm tree theme here in this instance. The county has one of the balancing projects that the county's leading is this extensive parking that's being added here along Santa Claus Lane, along with the crossing of the railroad tracks. So we're going to be able to see all of that activity take place. The planting will blend in with that sort of a feel. So this is a planting blow up of this interchange, showing the palm trees and a lot of flowering native trees as well. The next interchange is Evans Avenue. Very similar in the fact that it's used to access the beach. However, the difference is this is actually located in a little downtown of Summerlin. So this gets a lot of daily use by people in the community walking from their homes to the beach and access the park. You'll see right now we've got parking underneath the structure. Zach will go over in detail how these details are handled structurally, but from a planting perspective, you can see this is quite a bit different than the South Padaro neighborhood. The South Padaro is more of a day use. This is more of an all the time in your community feature of the neighborhood itself. So the planting here reflects that by being more pedestrian scale, a little bit more ornate, a little more colors. Here's an example of that planting concept. Finally, the Sheffield interchange. The main difference at Sheffield is the distinct rural character of this interchange. No pedestrians are present at this one. This is only access to the ramps. But when you come into Montecito and you go over the Ortega Hill, the character is quite a bit different. It's much more wooded, much less palm tree oriented, heavy on the cypress, oak trees, that sort of thing. So you'll see the planting concept reflect that. There are palms included, but they're random and they're spaced out. The major component of the landscape, at least, is cypress trees and oaks. You'll see the large-scale oaks here in the foreground. I'll touch quickly on the riparian planting. So we do have a couple of creek bridges. This is a riparian, and there's some planting associated with that. So as the freeway naturally drains to these drainages and these creeks, we're highlighting a different type of landscape. We're using riparian species like sycamore, redwood, alders, not redwood, but red bud, alders, poplars, and of course willow. Sorry, I'm experiencing a little delay. This is the view impact analysis that was done for the community of Summerlin. One of the unique features of Summerlin is that it's this community perched on almost a natural amphitheater, right, with views to the ocean. So it's very important to the community that we maintain those views while recognizing that we do need to add planting to the area. So each one of these cones is differentiated by the darkness of the blue or the red. So the dark blue cones are full ocean views, and these are the viewer locations for these. And you can see how the cone is kind of centered on that. A dark view is a full unfiltered ocean view. A light blue is a filtered ocean view. And of course the red is views that are already blocked by either trees or landform. So what we've done is we've made sure that our infill planting in these locations doesn't hinder these ocean views, but rather complements or accentuates where the view is already blocked. With that, I'll briefly touch on the structure at South Padaro Lane. Again, we've got the Type 80. I'll just go from the top down, essentially pointing out features as we go. From the top down, you see the Type 80. The structure itself is arched, reminiscent of the structures from the 40s and 50s. The abutments are used with a beech wood texture which is indicative of this region, particular region. A lot of the buildings there in the Santa Claus Lane district have that sort of feature associated with them. On the slope paving, you'll see this relaxed sort of a wave feature that's been incorporated to show some interest. There's a retaining wall that's actually, the purpose of that is to withstand this or uphold the slope for the Class 1 bike path that's coming in off Santa Claus Lane, but it made sense architecturally to wrap that under the structure and repeat it on the other side so that we've got a continuous feature. And of course, lighting proposed underneath, so that this can be used at all hours of the day. There is parking underneath this bridge. This is another simulation of the same bridge. You see this planter, this low retaining wall with planting in front of it, which can extend to some degree under the structure itself. This is a simulation of this structure at nighttime, showing how the lighting is soft but yet present. This is a lighting model to show what the lighting looks like underneath the structure. The main point here I want to point out is that the color is kind of a solid green, which indicates that this is a very consistent level of lighting. It's a relatively low level of lighting, but it's consistent. You won't see a lot of hot spots or bright spots. Next, we have two creek bridges. These creek bridges are slab bridges. They're not very thick, which means there's not a lot of opportunity for architectural detail to be incorporated. They're both both creek bridges have either a local road on one side and the railroad on the other, and which is at the same level. So they're not very visible, but we have incorporated the same type 80 texture, the same color throughout the entire bridge, and then there's this slight arched offset into the facade of the bridge itself. The last bridge in segment 4B is the North Padaro overcrossing. We're not making any modifications to the structure as it's sound, and it's doing its job as it needs to. We are, however, adding a slope paving to below the abutment here, which reduces maintenance efforts from erosion and sediment removal. Essentially, this is an exposed aggregate finish. The intent here is not to call a lot of attention to this feature, but to match the architecture of the bridge, which is relatively simple, and to blend in with the natural surroundings. With that, I'll pass it on to Zach to cover the 4C structures.
Thanks, Dave. As we start, we're looking at the Evans Undercrossing. So this is that same view that Dave showed earlier, looking towards the ocean. One thing to note with the Evans Undercrossing is that the two existing bridges that are there today are not being replaced. So this bridge, there's an existing gap between the northbound and southbound structure, and the widening is just completing the deck portion in between those two structures. So the outside bridges are going to remain, which poses some challenges, but also some unique opportunities for aesthetic treatments on this structure. One of the first things that we wanted to incorporate is improved pedestrian and bicycle access underneath the freeway. So I'll show some renderings in a little bit, but what you'll notice is their on-street parking has been removed underneath this structure. What's being proposed is a buffered bike lane, so there would be a Class 2 bike lane with a buffer between the vehicle traffic. That space we're accommodating that space by taking the existing sidewalk and moving it behind the columns. And in order to do that, since the abutment of the structure is really close by, we have to build a retaining wall right behind those columns to allow for that sidewalk to go behind there. And I have some detailed renderings of that I'll show in a minute. A similar treatment regarding that retaining wall to what Dave described at the Padaro Lane structure. As it comes under the bridge, instead of just ending, we wanted to wrap that retaining wall around into the slope, and that provides an opportunity for planting and other treatments. In addition, we are adding some architectural enhancements to the outside of the bridge itself. It's a little hard to see in this rendering, I think, just with the projector, but there is an arch that's been added to the outside girder of that existing bridge. I think some of the printed out versions of this will show that better. And in addition, there is also the Type 80 barrier that's going to replace the existing steel barrier that's along the bridge as well. So this is a rendering looking at the undercrossing itself. There was a lot of discussion as we were coordinating with the various bars as we were working through this, the aesthetic design process, what I wanted to highlight is this shows the overall palette of aesthetic treatments. We are still continuing to work with the community of Summerland on various details of this. So while the detailed aspects of, particularly the treatment on the retaining wall or the slope paving details or even the details for the sidewalk treatment, those may evolve as we work through final design approval, but in general, the scope of the aesthetic treatments are represented by these renderings. Regarding this retaining wall, there is a requirement from Caltrans at a state level that if a retaining wall exceeds a certain height, it's above 4 feet, there needs to be a railing at the top of that wall to provide safety for maintenance workers. We work through a lot of details to keep that wall underneath 4 feet tall, and that eliminates the need for having what is a 3-foot railing on top of there. So what's shown here is a 4-foot wall with no railing. You can just imagine what that would be if we had a 3-foot railing on top of there. And that was something that was supported through the bars. Similar to the Padara Lane structure, we did work through lighting analysis for the use of this particular road and this area at night. It's a little different than at Padaro in that this does have more active pedestrian traffic in the evening. So what's shown here are 3 different views. This is looking towards the ocean, this is underneath the structure, and this is looking back towards the Summerlin community. You can see that there's areas where there is uniform light, but then there's also higher lighting, which represents more of that pedestrian scale lighting to provide for a safe and visible pathway through there. Working through the design, it was determined that we would want overhead lights as well that provide that broad-based distribution of light underneath the structure, but then also having the pedestrian scale lighting to illuminate the pathway. So that's what's being presented is overhead lights as well as in-wall mounted lights that would illuminate the sidewalk. Through the process as well, there was also a request to allow various opportunities for either art or community identifiers. And we have identified locations for where that could be. Again, as we're looking towards the ocean, right here on the corner, there's an area that there is sufficient space for what could go in that location. That hasn't been determined yet, but that's something that we wanted to preserve that space for the community. And now we're on the other side of the structure looking back towards the Summerlin community. There's a similar space along the other corner that would be available for either art or some community identifier. So now we are looking at the Sheffield interchange. So this is what's proposed for the new undercrossing. This structure, while it's being completely replaced, there are various challenges from an engineering standpoint that really affect how much space we have for the structure. All of these designs for safety are based on certain grades and very strict requirements. So it was great discussion working with the various bars and the DRT on coming up with a design that enhanced the interchange while meeting all of those engineering requirements. So what's shown is an arch structure that's a 3-span structure, and the columns have architectural details to them. The type 80 barrier is, again, consistent along this structure. In addition, there is a little retaining wall that wraps around, coming underneath the bridge into the landscape around that, and that really enhances the planting that Dave went over earlier. And then underneath the structure, the slope paving and the area in between the sidewalk and the retaining wall is intended to mimic that contrast surface treatment that Dave went over, which is that cobble texture. So these would actually be cobbles that are set into concrete and grout, just like the contrast surface treatment area is. The bridge does also include integral color, so it's not going to be a standard gray color. It is going to have an integral color tone that is similar with some of the other structures. And with that, that concludes our presentation.
Thank you. That was just a great presentation, and I'm a public works nerd, so I'm really loving it. So this is the time when we ask our commissioners if we have any questions for any of our staff. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. I blasted through that earlier. Wanted to ask if the commission had any ex parte communications or site visits that they wanted to disclose before we start. Rather than regular use of this.
Well, kind of hard not to have a site visit. But I won't relate my 66 years of driving 101 and remembering the lights that were removed and all that.
Oh, yeah. My 30 years of playing at the Polo Club. So, okay, then let's go on to questions from the commission to any of our staff, unless you want to have it organized somehow differently just for county staff versus the Caltrans SB-CAG team. I think we could actually ask any of them, any of our questions. So that said, do we have any questions from commissioners? Mr. Park, Commissioner Park.
Call me whatever you want. Okay, this is Mr. Sevilla. I was fascinated when you spoke about the buffered bike lanes. And what is the buffering? Is it just paint on the pavement, or is it actually a surface that would, indicate to a driver that they were driving on a buffer now?
Currently, it's proposed to be thermoplastic striping, just like the other roadway striping. It's there to really provide that visual perspective for the driver, just to make sure that they are aware that there is that bike lane there. It's more than just your 4-inch wide stripe that you normally see along the road. So it's a 2-foot buffer with various striping in between there to really highlight that area.
Would it be possible to put that cobblestone in there too?
I would need to evaluate that from a maintenance standpoint. It would be something that would be maintained. The cobblestone is not intended to be driven on permanently, and while it can be driven on, like Dave described in those contrast surface treatment areas, permanent traffic, you would start to see those cobblestones start to break away. So it would potentially prove to be a long-term maintenance issue.
Right. Thanks.
Yeah.
Commissioner Cooney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have, I guess the questions go to you too. With regard to Evans undercrossing, you indicated there is work ongoing with the community about the artistic finishes. So at what point does that become part of the project?
So I'll start, and then Fred, I think I can hand it over to you to finish this. So we have been meeting with them throughout the whole process, beginning with the initial DRT that Fred mentioned in 2018. And even recently, we've continued to exchange various design ideas with the community. There's a lot of great details. It's a very important feature for the community, and we recognize that. And there's been a lot of great dialogue. When I describe the scope of the aesthetic designs, it is going to be on those retaining walls. It's going to be on the slope paving that's behind the retaining wall, the lighting, even the landscape palette itself. So the details of that will continue to be refined as we work through the final design approval. But the scope is represented in there. So when we show the various types of treatments for those elements, that's to give everyone an idea of where those aesthetic treatments will take place. And Fred, I'll pass it over to you just to talk about that.
I understand this question. The question is about Evans undercrossing?
Correct.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I was consulting. So as was indicated, we've had a number of meetings, both through the design review team process and as the bar, S-Bar in particular, was conducting their overview with the Summerlin community. Myself and other team members, including Kirsten Ayers, our public outreach coordinator who's here, met with Summerlin community members. We actually had a real focused design group with them. And the direction we were given at S-Bar was that we would continue to work with them on some of the finer details of the project that would be presented at final bar. We just got some information presented to us after several months last week, so we haven't been able to incorporate any of that in new renderings and new materials that this commission has been associated with. But we did give them a sense of areas that they could provide design input on and get community feedback that was somewhat accepted by the broader community, rather than just a small group of individuals. And so, like was presented, the retaining walls, the public art component, which, as you know, those may have to be implemented separately as independent projects. There's a process for doing public art. Any of the other aesthetic treatments, they did have some ideas on maybe the cobble treatment, or maybe integrating something that was more representative of Summerlin rather than just the wave feature, something that was more about their history. And so those all are potential things that could be integrated. We just, it would be part of our next steps. Like I said, we just got that information last week. We will continue to reach out and work with the community, and then as we work with your staff and as we schedule final bar, we'll be able to present some of those ideas. There are certain things that we won't be able to integrate, or we wouldn't support. They still are supportive of railing on top of the wall, and so I think, as you were heard, is that we were able to lower that, and we wouldn't want to see that introduced for a number of reasons into the project. But there are some aesthetic features that certainly can be added.
So my specific question, Mr. Luna, was at what point in the project does this art component, community input component, get incorporated into the project? So that can be taken up at any time as to what so our process, or Caltrans' typical process, would be to, if it's a public art component, as you saw in the display or the slideshow, was that there were separate areas that could be identified. And so really that has been made available. It could either be like, if it was something that would be a sculpture of some sort, or some type of that would be mounted, maybe the project could add through construction a concrete pad, and then the community would take up what would be actually placed in that area. Or if it's some more of an improvement related to park benches or things like that, the same type of thing. We had discussions with the community about maybe adding concrete pads for benches that would be something that would maybe the community would take up upon themselves to. What would they like to see there, as a little plaza or something in those areas. So you suggested that there'll be a final BAR review, and when do you imagine, in general, that would take place in this scope of the project as you see it today?
So, as you can imagine, we've been really focused on getting to this point to date. Obviously, our current schedule is to go to construction in the fall of this year. We would like to perhaps do that in the spring, pending approval of the project. And that gives us time to look at some of the ideas that the community has presented, vet them technically, and continue to work on that level with the community, and then see if we can incorporate those into the project, and then present those at final bar.
So that's exactly what I was looking for. Is you're looking to do that in the near future to coordinate these ideas? And I mean, I understand there are ideas, lots of ideas about what could be done. They have to be settled on at some point.
So it's uniform. Yeah, we have to look at, there was a number of different ideas that were presented, and we haven't looked at how they all fit together, as far as, a complete palette. And then there are some of those components that we don't yet have any direction from the community as far as a public art component or things like that. That would really have to be a separate project that would extend beyond that time frame. but some of those that are part of the project, we certainly want to integrate those now. It's most cost effective to have those part of the contract plans rather than having to make a change later.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful. I had one additional question. I think it'll be a lot quicker. With regard to the Sheffield undercrossing, there are some remaining cypress trees that are in the center median, and I'm gathering by the new planned vegetation that those trees are going to be out as far as when the new roadbed is developed.
That's correct. Ms. Liu talked about how the interchange configuration is changing. So currently there are the left-hand exits and left-hand entrance, and with the project that swaps and those left-hand exits become right-side exits, and so the main line shifts into that median space. So that median planting is removed, but there was a focused effort on preserving as much planting space as possible on the outside of the freeway.
So that's a case where the current median design is balanced with the need for that space, so it's pushing to the outside.
That's right.
And is there, I got a little confused some of the time, 2 bridges were remaining, or it was eliminated. In Summerlin, I think it's being eliminated, so there's just one roadbed going forward. How about Sheffield?
Yeah. At the Evans structure, it is going to be one structure, so it's widening to infill the 2 structures. At Sheffield, there is a gap in between the 2 structures, and that was intended to provide for an offset between the northbound and southbound lanes. Currently, as you come over or take a hill, the southbound lanes are lower, so you have a great view out towards the ocean. In the design, we wanted to preserve that even with moving the freeway into the median area. So the southbound lanes are lower, and so we have 2 separate structures. The gap between them is about 6 feet. So the 2 structures are really needed just to preserve that view from the northbound lanes over to the ocean.
Okay, and another favorite of mine, passing over that area now, is that there's a too abrupt right to left curve as you're coming north. You come up, you come down the hill, you're picking up speed, and all of a sudden there's a gradual turn that some people make and others don't, and a lot of accidents happen. I assume that's all being corrected.
That's correct. In that curve, it's going to be improved to a standard 10-foot inside shoulder. So right now, as you're coming in the northbound direction, that bridge barrier really does come really close towards the travelway.
Yes.
And as part of the project, that'll be a standard 10-foot inside shoulder all the way through there.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, did any other commissioners have questions? I've got more questions. I've got a couple. But Mr. Freed? No. Okay. Let me just get to my questions page. Hold on a second. Can someone just in total context give me like a traffic projection? Well, how much has it grown in this link in the last 10 to 20 years? Because I know that was part of their argument when everybody said we don't want 3 lanes, because I was actually on the Parsons-Brinkerhoff team like 30 years ago, before the 101 in motion. So what has the volume done? This will partially address, and do you have projections for it? Because I know in Ms. Liu's staff report, it was talking about levels of service generally improving, except for the Sheffield interchange. So maybe you can just give me a quick answer on the volume question.
Oh, microphone on. So the projections are for 30 years, so they go out to 2040. The environmental document looked at also a opening year scenario, which happened to be this current year, 2020. That shows you how long it takes to get some of these public works improvements completed. The projection for traffic on mainline, I assume that's what you're talking about.
ADT.
Is so currently we, for a sense, we have about 100,000 vehicles at near Milpas per, average daily traffic, and then down by the county line, maybe like 60,000. And so that was in my recollection is that that would go up to approximately like 130 to 140,000. I think it was about 1% per year that they were, but it's significant enough that we have a congestion problem, so any growth with only 2 lanes will just exacerbate that issue. And so the addition of a lane is the congestion relief strategy.
Okay, thank you. It just helps for broad context. The stage of local approval that you need for the grant funding, you have already secured a bunch of grants, and I know you can apply for grants, but is it the environmental document approval or the actual entitlement approval for you to have grants released? I'm just a nerd about this. I'm sorry, but I'm going to ask the question because I appreciate how long it takes to get to your stage.
No, that's a great question because it's really a threshold question. If I was to award funding to any agency, I would ask, like, what level of approvals do you have, to move this project forward? And so the grant process at the statewide level, for which we were successful with the first 3 segments, the first 7 miles, the threshold for that is that they like you to have environmental approval under CEQA for that. And